Good afternoon. My name is Angela Panmaka, and I'm the designated federal officer for the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Welcome to all of our virtual attendees. Today's meeting is being live streamed to allow members of the public to attend this virtual meeting and is also being recorded. The video will be posted on our website. As we begin our first live stream plenary meeting, allow me to share a few procedural remarks. The Commission is an independent presidential advisory committee created by Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act and is operating under the Federal Advisory Committee Act and the Government in the Sunshine Act. Today's meeting was announced in a Federal Register notice on Tuesday, July 7th, 2020. The public was invited to submit written comments for the Commission to consider. 4 comments were received through our invitation and are considered public, which will be posted along with the meeting minutes. There have been no significant changes to today's meeting agenda as posted in the Federal Register notice. Depending on time constraints, there may be an opportunity for members of the public to provide written comments or questions to be addressed to the Commission today at the end of the meeting. For those joining us via the live stream, you can provide comments or questions via Twitter by tweeting or messaging at AI Commission and via our YouTube live meeting. With that, I say welcome and I call this meeting to order. I will now turn the meeting over to the Commission's Executive Director, Illy Bayraktarı, for opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Illy Bayraktarı, and I serve as the Executive Director of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. It is my pleasure to welcome commissioners as well as members of the general public to today's Q2 plenary meeting. To members of the general public and media, on behalf of the NSCAI commissioners and staff, I would like to thank you for your interest in the work of the Commission and for your participation in today's plenary meeting via live stream. We received more than 200 RSVPs from members of the public, along with 12 members of the press. The Commission remains eager to hear from you as we examine the most significant national security dimensions of artificial intelligence. As mentioned by the designated federal officer, those tuning in today can provide comments or questions via Twitter or YouTube. We also have a request for comment in the Federal Register where individuals and organizations can submit comments to the Commission regarding topics within its congressional mandate. To NSCAI commissioners, the purpose of today's virtual public plenary meeting is to deliberate and vote on Q2 recommendations for Congress and the executive branch. Each line of effort chair will deliver 5-minute remarks that present the set of recommendations for deliberation. NSCAI professional staff are standing by to answer any factual questions if needed. I will provide a short summary of the discussion before moving on to vote. Votes will be called for affirmative response, negative response, and abstentions. Recommendations must receive a majority vote to pass. Results of the vote will be announced during the call today. I would like now to turn it over to Dr. Eric Schmidt, the chair of the Commission, and Mr. Robert Work, the vice chair of the Commission, to deliver a few remarks. Dr. Schmidt.
Well, thank you so much, Illy. Thank you all for joining us. We are very happy to have everyone joining us to make this meeting happen. AI turns out to be even more important. It's important for dealing with the pandemic. It's important to dealing for our national security. It's important to deal with economic growth. It's more and more and more important. And what we decided to do, rather than wait till our congressionally mandated deadline of the end of essentially early next year, was to speed up and try to do quarterly or roughly quarterly meetings. We did a first quarter meeting where we had a series of what we considered easy wins, things which were no-brainers that the Congress could consider to add to the NDAA and similar legislation. And we've been working hard with our partners in Congress to try to figure out how to make those things happen. And I think many of them will. So we think it's been well done and a good process so far. Now that it's our second quarter, we decided to take a deeper look and debate 6 lines of effort. And our theory today is you'll see us debate. There will be agreement and disagreement, and that's a healthy process, but you'll see it and you'll see it in public. And this is all, the transparency is all very good, and we'll have some votes. So I hope you enjoy that aspect of it. Our current thinking, which of course is subject to change, is to do another one of these in the October-ish timeframe. We haven't set the date yet. And then use the combination of the last one, this one, and the next one to help us with our final report. And again, with your feedback and engagement in all the obvious ways. What you'll hear today are the details about what we need to do in the research area, very important, partners, very important, the labor force training issues. Majority of our recommendations last time were related to labor force, getting people technically trained, all very important. A significant discussion about ethics, and of course, all of the issues about building a powerful platform so that this can be executed in the interest of our nation's best interests, basically. I wanted to take a minute to thank the staff. We have, of course, like everyone else, been affected by the pandemic, and all of the work you're seeing has been done virtually by people doing their very best using the tools at hand. And I'm very proud of how we've been able to use the tools both at the staff level and the commission level. And I anticipate that will be the remainder of our service to the country is through these mechanisms. So with that, thank you all. Thanks to the commissioners. And Bob, would you like to add anything or extend your views?
Yes, thank you, Eric. Again, I'd like to echo Eric's welcome to everybody who's joining us this afternoon, to include the commissioners and the staff, as well as all of the viewers who are watching this on YouTube. The commissioners are all of the same mind that the United States government has to organize, resource, and train to understand and employ AI-enabled technologies for all of the reasons that Eric outlined. It will affect our economic competitiveness. It will affect our national security competitiveness. It will improve the lives of our citizens. And we want to do all of these things ethically, responsibly, in close partnership with the private sector, academia, non-governmental organizations, and international partners. And we believe that today's recommendations, if approved, will advance all of these efforts. I'm not going to go into them, but as Eric said, we divided our work into 6 lines of effort. Line of effort 1 is entitled Invest, and it really is making recommendations to equip the federal government and the DoD enterprise with the necessary resources, tools, infrastructure, and support of AI R&D, test and evaluation, verification and validation capabilities, all of these different areas. And I think you'll find the recommendations that LOE1 came up with to be very interesting. LOE2 is entitled Apply. This is establishing a strategic approach for identifying resources and ultimately fielding AI-enabled applications that address clear operational challenges facing the Department of Defense. Create mechanisms for tactical experimentation so that we can understand how these applications work and we have the trust in them to do what we expect them to do. Line of effort 3 is really about training the entire federal government and especially the DoD workforce for an AI future. And there are some really big ideas in LOE3, and I can't wait for us to discuss them and for you to hear them. LOE4 is called Protect. And this whole line of effort is really how do we protect our advantages in a global AI competition with the stakes that are so high. And these are going to consider and implement new controls to protect our emerging technology across 3 categories. Technology protection policies, export controls to AI, and a focus on CFIUS on preventing the transfer of technologies that might create national security risks. LOE5 is Marshall. Marshall's support of all democratic and like-minded nations who believe that the values, that our democratic values have to be reflected in all of our AI endeavors. And so it really focuses this quarter on improving the Department of State's infrastructure to be AI ready in an era of great power competition. LOE6 is ethics. Everything that the commission has done from the very beginning has been done under the understanding that ethics are very, very important, and how the departments and agency implement key recommendations and considerations on the development of AI are absolutely critical. We've been working with our partners in Congress, and they have provided us unbelievably great support, as well as the executive branch. Same thing, same level of great support. And we look forward to continuing this partnership, which we feel has deepened and broadened and is on a very, very good track. We believe in a bold approach to approaching AI, and We want to reimagine our digital workforce. We want to overcome ingrained bureaucracies and develop new operating concepts. It's just a very, very exciting time and an exciting time to be part of this commission. As Illy mentioned, we're going to move through today's discussion by following the outline of the draft recommendations. We're going to start with line of effort 3, train first. Each of the LOE leads are going to take 5 minutes to actually go over the big ideas. And that will be followed by about 15 minutes for discussion. And then we will vote on the recommendations. As Eric said, the key to a successful commission is having a good executive director and staff. And we are absolutely blessed to have Illy Bajraktari as our executive director and about 50 tremendously capable patriots who are working with us to provide these recommendations to Congress and the executive branch. So with that, I'll turn it over to line of effort 3. And we will talk about training our workforce for the future. Jose?
Good afternoon, my fellow commissioners, and those of you who are watching NSCAI's plenary session online. Dr. William Mark, Mignon Claiborne, Bob Walk, and I have developed 3 recommendations in this quarter, which, if adopted, will mark a dramatic change in the government digital workforce. The first recommendation is to create a National Reserve Digital Corps. While there are digital experts who are willing to work for the government for a full career, and others who will serve full-time for several years, the United States government needs a better way to tap into the expertise of those who'd like to contribute to American national security, but are unwilling or unable for some reason to become full-time government employees or military reservists. While short-term volunteers are not a substitute for full-time employees, they can help improve AI education for both technologists and non-technical leaders, perform data triage and acquisition, help guide projects and frame technical solutions, build bridges between the public and private sector, and other important tasks. And this aligns with judgments 15 and 17 from the interim report. The National Reserve Digital Corps would fall under the Office of Management and Budget. The OMB would select node leaders. We see an organization around nodes. OMB would select node leaders and provide administrative, technical, and financial support, and some oversight and project selection. Node leaders would be responsible for recruiting, for most project selection, and partnership with government agencies. Members of the National Reserve Digital Corps would work at least 38 days a year as advisors, instructors, or developers. And their incentives to participate would include a scholarship program modeled after the ROTC and a continuing education fund. The second recommendation is to expand the Scholarship for Service programs. Digital proficiency requires greater expertise within the government across many disciplines, including cybersecurity, AI, network architecture, software engineering, data science, computer science, mathematics, robotics, and others. With more funding, Scholarship for Service programs will quickly increase the digital talent in government service. This recommendation aligns with judgments 15 and 17 from the interim report, and with the Commission's first quarter recommendation to increase funding for select scholarship and fellowship programs. The third recommendation is to create a United States Digital Service Academy. The United States needs a new academy to train future public service servants in digital skills. Our proposed United States Digital Service Academy, it's quite a mouthful, so USDSA, would be an accredited degree-granting university that receives government funding, would be an independent entity within the federal government, and meets the government's need for digital expertise. This recommendation aligns with Judgment 17 from the interim report. USDSA would be an accredited degree granting university receiving government funding. It would provide technical education to students during the school year, and then students would participate in government and private sector internships during the summer. And I'd like to note that our recommendation includes a multi-year implementation plan. So we believe that these three ideas together would make a significant difference, not only in providing the government with better access to experts in the private sector and in academia, but also to begin to address the issues of how to scale up the digital talent within and available to the federal government. So that's my brief summary of our three recommendations. And I'd like to open it for questions. Perhaps other members of our line of effort working group would like to comment as well. So.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to chime in. I am, while in sync with what has been put forth, my only concern, and it is not a problem, just a concern that I wanted to flag, that for us to all forever be mindful that talent comes in many forms and from many places. And so being from the South, you know, I always say if the recruitment only happens down places where the roads are paved, then you've missed a lot of opportunities and a lot of talent. So when, as we move forward and when we think about how things are implemented, we should always be mindful to be inclusive. And recognize that in every corner of this nation there is talent by way of those young people and not so young people and opportunities in this space. So that's my observation for the day.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. We've discussed that several times, and I think as we move forward, probably with our next set of recommendations, looking at how do we build that pipeline, a diverse pipeline, a fully inclusive and diverse pipeline becomes important. That's really not part of today's recommendations, but hopefully our recommendations going forward. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So this is Eric. I agree with both I very strongly agree with your recommendations. And I also agree with Mignon's point, which I know is your intent. Why would people be opposed to I'm going to use my phrasing, an ROTC that has a digital component and a digital service academy? Why would people say that's a bad idea, given that we need so much technical expertise in the military, in the civilian, in the federal government in general?
As an educator, for me, it's hard to believe why there would be, but Justin, you've been talking, Justin Lynch, the lead on our staff team, has talked to a number of people about these recommendations. Justin, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, ma'am. One of the concerns that's expressed is cost. The startup cost for a digital service academy or any other institution of that scale isn't small. We did do a cost estimate, however, and looking at the way the government recruits young people through scholarship for service programs and the other pipelines, we do think that once a digital service academy was stood up, the cost would actually be roughly equivalent. But that has been the primary issue we've heard.
So what you're saying is the government is already hiring digital people, and your proposals would effectively substitute that cost for presumably even a higher quality and longer term workforce.
That's correct. What we're really talking about is expanding scale. However, so there's scholarships for service programs that work very well now, but they're limited in scope. We believe that those could be expanded in scope and then complemented very well by having a digital service academy that provides recruits of a different value, as you mentioned, or so we can have a more diverse candidate pool, very similar to the way that the military recruits from both ROTC and from service academies.
And I think that last point is key in terms of how do you ensure that you have a wide pool from all places. One way to do that is in a different non-traditional way, by way of the classic educational model, because not everyone has access to that. And so in order to ensure that no matter where you are, who you are, or what you have in terms of your economic portfolio, is there a way for you to on-ramp or onboard or get into the pipeline here? And I think the recommendations take that into account.
And Eric, this is Bob. A large percentage of the federal workforce is retirement eligible or will soon be retirement eligible. So we have to replace people, and we wanted to increase the overall digital literacy of the federal workforce. So these three are really focused on civilians, government civilians working in the federal government and in DoD, because right now the Department of Defense is doing a pretty good job in seeking out STEM talent. So this was really looked at as the broader federal government and increasing the digital literacy so that the whole government would benefit.
This is Gilman. You know, besides literacy, I think just overall, we face a huge shortage of AI professionals. And we have to start early. And I'm glad that we are recommending an ROTC-like program, because it's a way to engage more broadly a younger group of individuals who will seek that track. And I also think the reserve force is really particularly important for accessing talent outside of the government to help the government. The shortage is incredible across the entire industry, and even more so on the government side. And if we are going to use AI responsibly, we had to have the best personnel to actually develop it and utilize it.
This is Eric Horvitz. Thanks, Mignon, for mentioning interesting issues and opportunities when it comes to addressing disparity in our nation. Great opportunity and frame for thinking that through deeply in standing up a new program like this this creative recommendation on a digital force. I am curious to hear from staff and or the commissioners on closely related service-oriented programs, traditional, non-traditional, that we can learn from for best practices or gotchas in moving forward with this this idea.
This is Katrina from one of the commissioners. Also, I just would like to say that there is actually exchange programs with industry. We send oftentimes some of our executive leadership program civilians and our more advanced military members, and we send them into industry for exchanges, and we bring in members of industry into the government spaces. Particularly when I was president of the DAU, we had an exchange program with industry people to come and learn how the government does procurement activities. What the diversity that comes with is immense, because we in the government sometimes get to be isolated from what the currency is of the moment, both in dialogue and in interests and biases. So I think this is a very remarkable opportunity that we could bring in a more diverse thought process into this government workspace.
And Eric, this is Bob. Remember, this builds upon our Q1 recommendations, which really went after some low-hanging fruit, like the Cyberforce Scholarship for Service is very, very good. And so we tried to hit all of those in the first quarter because those are working. They're working well. But this really is focused on scale, as Dr. Griffith said. This is really trying to increase the level of effort in the government and the number of folks who are digitally savvy. So it's the combination of both Q1 and these specific recommendations.
Can I turn it over to Stephen Chin, who has been waiting for a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the government is not unique in the shortage of both, digitally savvy and AI trained workforce. And really, a lot of the great recommendations here are about the government leveling the playing field and catching up to things that the tech sector and other organizations are doing. So it's extremely important because if you go and ask many organizations working in AI, they will say that their number one limitation, or at least one of their top limitations, is lack of qualified staff.
Thank you. And I know, Eric, you had a question. Justin, do you want to answer to Dr. Horvitz's question?
Absolutely. So we drew on CyberCore Scholarship for Service and Smart Scholarship for Service in particular to inspire some of the programs that we're talking about, which has had two results. One is a direct recommendation to expand both of those programs and provide the funding to expand both of those programs, which is the second recommendation. And the other was it was one of the inspirations for the way that the National Reserve Digital Corps would recruit and train college students to be involved with both the scholarship component of it and then some of the opportunities for internships as well. That's where we received quite a bit of our model for both the administrative component and the financial component of it.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
And if I could just jump in, we also realize that graduates from the Scholarship for Service programs, after they've completed their service obligation, could potentially then transfer into the Reserve Corps, the National Digital Reserve Corps as well. So we'd actually keep access to them for a much longer period of time.
Any other comments, questions?
I would just underscore Mignon's comment about we really need to reach out to everyone. And I think that's one way to think about addressing the overall shortage that Steve was just talking about. I think if we expand the opportunities to come into the field of AI, we'll go a long way towards addressing that gap.
So is there, in the spirit of moving forward, I detect loud agreement. Is there any substantive disagreement on this general category of training, digital reserve, et cetera? So Illy, how do we actually come to a consensus? What is our process?
So now I'll turn it over to Bob Work, so he can call the vote to motion.
Okay.
Assuming there is no further discussion, I'd like a motion to accept the 11 recommendation, excuse me, the 3 recommendations in LOE 3 as outlined by Dr. Griffiths. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Bob, I want to know if I can vote 3 times.
No, we're going to.
I have a real bad joke on bad follow-up joke on that, but we're being taped.
Okay, so I'm okay. Just checking. I'm an enthusiastic yes.
All right. I think I heard a second. Illy, did someone second? Okay. We have a motion and a second. So all those in favor of accepting the 3 recommendations as outlined by Dr. Griffiths, LOE 3, please say aye.
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 Are there any objections from any of the commissioners? Hearing none, are there any abstentions from any of the commissioners? Hearing none, we have unanimous approval of the 3 recommendations in LOE 3. And now we will move to LOE 4, protect. And I'll turn it back over to Illy for the MC role.
Thank you, sir. And just for the record, we have 12 commissioners out of 15 online. Just so I know, sometimes typing this, it has to go to the record. We'll turn it over to LOE 4, which is protecting and building U.S. tech advantages and hardware. I'll turn it over to the chair of this LOE, Gilman Louie. Gilman.
Billy, thanks a lot. And Bob, I'll go as fast as I can. Got a lot to cover in 5 minutes. So good afternoon. My name is Gilman Louie. I'm the chair of Line of Effort 4. Working with my fellow commissioners, Chris Darby and Jason Matheny, our group focused on our recommendations to protect and promote U.S. strategic advantages in AI and associated technologies. During today's discussion, we will focus on LOE's 4 proposed Q2 recommendations on technology protection, specifically export controls and investment screening. These recommendations build on our consensus judgments 20, 21, and 22 from the Commission's interim report. Our Q2 recommendations also connect to LOE 4's Q1 recommendations to expand the U.S. government's AI-enabling microelectronics programs and advance U.S. 5G development. Since releasing these recommendations, the commissions have been encouraged by recent developments in Congress, the executive branch, and private sector to revitalize domestic fabrication of the state-of-the-art microelectronics. Highlights include the recent announcements by TSMC and Intel Corporation, as well as the introduction of the bipartisan CHIPS for America Act. For our Q2 recommendation, LOE4 first developed 4 broad principles which underpin the group's approach to export control and investment screening. We believe these principles should also serve as a guide for future policy making on technology protection. The written document describes these principles in greater details, but in short, they are: 1, controls cannot supplant investment and innovation. 2nd, US strategies to promote and protect emerging technologies such as AI must be integrated. 3rd, export controls on widespread and dual-use technologies such as AI must be targeted, strategic, and coordinated with allies. And 4th, the United States should provide a more discerning approach on export controls while broadening investment screening. These principles inform our 8 Q2 recommendations across the following 3 categories. 1, enhancing capacity to carry out effective technology protection policy. 2, applying export controls to AI. 3, focusing CFIUS on preventing the transfer of technologies that create national security risks. We are also preparing a draft executive order on applying export controls to AI, a legislative proposal strengthening CFIUS, which would serve as implementation vehicles for several of our recommendations. I'll now describe each category and its corresponding recommendations in greater detail. After that, we'll open up the floor. Let's start with the first key point: enhancing capacity to carry out effective technology protection policies. LOE4's first category of recommendations pertain to enhancing the U.S. capacity to carry out effective technology protection policies. This category contains 2 recommendations intended to strengthen the internal technology capacity of key regulatory agencies responsible for export control. Recommendation number 1 is to mandate that the Department of Commerce coordinate new rules with existing technological advisory groups that include outside experts. Recommendation 2 is to designate a network of federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs, and university-affiliated research centers, UARCs, to serve as a shared technical resource on export control and to help automate review process. Point number 2, apply export controls to AI. LOE4's second category of recommendations pertain to applying export controls to AI, including 4 recommendations across 4 issue areas. These 4 recommendations are intended to promote AI-related export controls, which are targeted, strategic, and coordinated with allies, and will maximize impact on strategic competitors, but minimize harm on U.S. industry. Recommendation number 3 is to prioritize hardware controls to protect U.S. national security advantages in AI and consider future controls surrounding data. Recommendation number 4 is for the President to expedite key Export Control Reform Act, ECRA, and Foreign Investment Risk Reduction Modernization Act, FIRMA, regulations by issuing executive orders directing the Department of Commerce to finalize the identification of emerging and foundational technologies under ECRA. Recommendation number 5 is that the United States should work with the Netherlands and Japan to restrict export of extreme ultraviolet and argon fluoride immersion lithograph equipment to China and take steps to increase demand for such tools among U.S. firms. Recommendation number 6 is that the Department of State, Commerce, and Treasury should work with allies on legal reform to implement unilateral export controls and enhance investment screening. The third key area, focusing CFIUS on protecting the transfer of technologies that create national security risks. LOE4's third and final category of recommendations pertain to the focusing CFIUS on preventing the transfer of technologies that create national security risks and contains 2 recommendations. These 2 recommendations are as follows. Recommendation number 7 is to grant Treasury the authority to mandate CFIUS filings for non-controlling investments in AI and other sensitive technologies from China, Russia, and other competitor nations. Recommendation number 8 is to expedite Treasury's Department CFIUS exemption standards for allies and partners and create fast tracks for exempted trusted investors. I will now open the floor for a discussion on these 8 recommendations, and I invite my other members of LOE4, Chris Darby and Jason Muthini, to participate in answers. I open up the floor. Yes.
This is Safra. I think that this is a very, very important area, maybe one of the single most important areas that this focus and the way the group has really focused in on how to make this actionable is very, very important, because a lot of people talk about CFIUS and some of these other issues, and the way to actually make this happen is focusing on the different groups that can give valid input, because we do have to continue to innovate, and sometimes that's in partnership. And you also take you take a point about making sure that investment continues in this area. And the most significant point, which is that this is not a substitute for investment. This is that we have to continue to be the innovators and the leaders, and you need capital investment to make that happen. I think this is really incredibly thoughtful. All the different things are very carefully thought out, and I think it's a very impressive work, frankly.
Thank you, Safra. I think the commissioners on this LOE worked very hard to focus our efforts on targeted controls rather than broad-based controls. And as we said, and as you pointed out, look, the best way to protect is to stay ahead. And
Right.
so we should treat nations that are friendly, that are cooperative and share values, and put them on a much faster track than other countries who may be competitors. And so that was the foundation of our recommendations.
Gilman,
I think, I'm sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
Are you satisfied that you have it really precisely written enough that it can be translated into a policy that can be workable? In other words, is it defined well enough?
I think it is. I think the key part to make all this work is to give the various agencies appropriate access to expert talent. I think that the challenge on a lot of the agencies is some of these technologies are moving so rapidly, it's hard to keep up. That's why we said for the leveraging of the FFRDC and UARCs to provide that knowledge base so that fast decision-making can be made, and that will allow it to be much more actionable. I think it's also important for the White House to outline with Commerce what specifically are the key areas of emerging technologies so that there is no fuzziness out there. And right now, it's a little bit of a guessing game between the industry and the government, and we want to clear those lanes to make it much more clear on which items will take extra scrutiny versus items which should be able to sail through.
I'll turn it over to Katharina McFarland next, and then Dr. Eric Horvitz after.
Thank you, Yuli. You know, Steve, I thought and spent quite a bit of time reading between level of effort 4 recommendations from this subcommittee and level of effort 5, because I think it's very important when we talk about our next area, which is marshaling global AI cooperation, that they have something meaningful to grasp and to start those discussions around. And so I felt that one of the important things that we should make sure, and I think it has been done, but I'd encourage the other commissioners and the staff to take a close look at it, is between level of effort 4 and level of effort 5, that there's that synergy to allow for us to focus. And I think being specific about first entities and where we would want to put our emphasis on will help us start moving forward, because of course, from our interim assessment, we were very concerned about the leakage and the fast adoption, whereas we have been slow in adopting. So I think these are very important, and also very important to be integrated between these level of efforts, which personally, I think my assessment in the read has been that it's good.
Thank you, Katharina. Dr. Horvitz.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the work, Gilman and team. I want to go back to, harken back to interim report last year when we talked about one of America's advantages in the world has been that our universities, companies, and culture are magnets for the world's best talent, including AI talent, and we need to encourage that talent to come and contribute and stay, as well as think deeply about the importance of engaging internationally when it comes to the core science of AI, where there cannot be any kind of barriers or Fortress America when it comes to innovation, lest we shoot ourselves in the foot. We actually said in the interim report here, I'll say it again, any US restrictions or controls must be narrowly tailored, pointing out to what Eric was just asking about, linked to specific threats and employed in ways that promote academic and commercial leadership in AI. Policies must fuel, not stifle, the innovation culture and values at the heart of our national power. So with that, being cautious, especially with headers like export controls on AI. AI itself is a broad term. We have to be very cautious about recommendation leak, even in people who might casually read a header like that, and think deeply about tailoring into workable safeguards, for example, in certain areas of hardware.
Yeah, we would agree with that. I think, look, it's very easy to take a broad definition application technology like AI and apply it everywhere. And so we were very specific and focusing on areas around hardware, right? Potentially data on certain matters, less so on algorithms, because most algorithms are open source. Everything has some level of AI, being planned to put into it, from video games to everyday technologies like your washing machines. That's not what we're after. I think they have to pose a national security risk, right? And they need to be targeted, right, where countries who want to license or invest, should have certain levels of scrutiny, and it shouldn't be broad-based. Technology being licensed to Canada might have a different level of scrutiny than to one of our competitors, and we want to make those adjustments. Again, we need industry to be able to move very quickly through our process. We need the capabilities to make quick judgments. But as you point out, it needs to be focused, it needs to be targeted, and it needs to really be involved around an issue around national security.
Any other commissioner from this LE wants to chime in?
No, I do, Safra, just one last thing. Of course, when we work with allies, we have to move that as quickly as possible, but we also have to understand what their intentions are and how they cooperate with some of our strategic competitors. So we just have to really think out, okay, we've given it to one of our European allies. Obviously, we allow them to invest. What are their limitations as far as dealing with some of our strategic competitors? And we just, this is only our there's more to come, more work here, but very.
We concur with that. We in fact clearly pointed out in our recommendations that our allies also need to strengthen their regimes and their controls. They should not rely on third parties to do that work for them. If they want to be fast tracked, then they need to have similar sorts of protections that we have to make sure our technologies and their technologies do not end up in systems that do great harm.
Katharina? You're muted, I'm sorry.
Pardon me, first one to do the goof here. Focus on the Committee for Foreign Investment in U.S. Has there been any feedback on that would indicate that that was negative? My first reaction was very positive, but that's because of clients I have. Is there anybody who's had any indication that there's an issue with that?
I'll turn it over to Chris McGuire. Chris, do you want to chime in? Or Kevin?
Sure. I think by and large, we've received very positive feedback on this. Obviously, on the fast tracking allies portion of it, I think that's kind of universally agreed upon that needs to happen. And the better and faster you can do that, the more effective your regime will be. There obviously is a debate on how we should approach sensitive technologies with respect to China and Russia. Initially, when FIRMA was on the Hill, there was much stronger controls in the bill on China and Russia, and those were ultimately stripped out. Our recommendation is to put some of those back in, but to have them basically be very tailored to certain elements of technologies and only focused on certain countries. And we think that by minimizing the scope of that, we will deal with a lot of the problems that it had initially in some of the pushback.
Thank you.
Katie, I also think it's really important for, as we said, as our first principle, right, that restrictions and controls are not a substitute for investments. I think there is potential pushback from industry if we do not encourage more investments, particularly in the microelectronics space, right? A large number of foreign investment is coming into the US for new technologies around chips and microelectronic technologies because of a lack of other investment options. This is a really important issue for the country. So if we're going to slow down because an investment area because we're going to add extra scrutiny, we need to increase investments from another area, and that's going to be key to making this thing work.
Thanks, Gilman. Just going back to Kevin, if you wanted to add anything.
Just agree with Chris that I think the climate has changed a little bit since this was originally put into potentially the House or Senate version of the Investment Screening Modernization Act, and so we think the time is right for some of these recommendations to be put in place. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Andrew Moore, thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to the Vice Chair, Mr. Bob Work.
All right. Hearing no further discussion, I'd like to have a motion to accept the 9 recommendations of LOE 4 Protect as outlined by Gilman. Do I have a motion?
Motion.
Thanks, Katerina. Second?
Second.
Thanks, Eric. All right, having a motion and a second, I'd like to ask all of the commissioners to indicate if they all in favor of these 9 recommendations.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Right? Any objections? Hearing no objections, any abstentions? Hearing none, we have a unanimous recommendation to adopt, a unanimous vote to adopt the 9 recommendations of LOE 4. And we will now move on to LOE 5, which is Marshall, and Jason Matheny is the head of that LOE and will take us through it.
Great, thanks, Bob. LOE 5 is focused on recommendations for global AI collaboration. Our group includes my wonderful fellow commissioners, Chris Darby and Gilman Louie, and our extraordinarily capable staff, including Rebecca Kennel, Matt Cordova, Paul Lakis, Christy Lawrence, and Madeline Blanchard. LOE 5 covers judgments 24 through 27 as set out in the Commission's interim report. The first quarter recommendations on LOE 5 topics focused on ways to improve AI cooperation among key allies and partners by establishing a national security policy framework for AI cooperation and pursuing AI-related concept and capability development with allies and partners, beginning with a focus on the Five Eyes Alliance. In the second quarter, we focused on recommendations to enable the United States to play to its strengths and enable the Department of State to engage coalitions of free and open states. We focused on how to improve the infrastructure of the department to effectively advance national priorities in AI and emerging technologies, and marshal global AI cooperation by forming coalitions centered on democratic values. LOE 5 presents 5 recommendations, and each of these recommendations builds on consensus judgments of the Commission as set out in the interim report. To develop the details of these recommendations, the staff engaged in extensive research and consulted with numerous experts, including the State Department, retired American diplomats, US national security leaders in multiple departments, European diplomats, and other technical experts. I'll review each recommendation, identify the issue that gave rise to the recommendation, the proposed solution, and how we propose to implement the recommendation. Recommendation 1, the Secretary of State should establish a Strategic Innovation and Technology Council composed of the department's senior leadership. As motivation for this, we think that the State Department currently lacks a convening body that's sufficiently senior for leadership to address AI and other emerging technologies. Establishing a council is a low-cost way to ensure coordination across the department, enhance the Secretary's efforts to modernize the department, and champion integrating mechanisms to overcome partition responsibilities. We propose to implement this by a recommendation to the executive branch. Recommendation 2 is that the Department of State and Congress should expedite efforts to establish the proposed Bureau of Cyberspace Security and Emerging Technology. This bureau had already been proposed by the State Department, and we believe it's needed for the department's diplomatic engagement on the security dimensions of AI and other emerging technologies, which currently lacks a resource bureau. We believe that the department's proposal to create such a bureau should be implemented, and we believe that the department should be able to move forward to coordinate with key congressional committees for authorization to establish and fund the bureau. We propose to implement this by a recommendation to the executive and legislative branches. Recommendation 3 is that the Department of State should enhance its presence in major foreign and US technology hubs and establish a cadre of dedicated technology officers at US embassies and consulates to strengthen diplomatic advocacy, improve technology scouting, and inform policy and foreign assistance choices. As motivation for this, we believe that the department would benefit from a presence in major technology hubs, both domestically and overseas, to inform policy development, access leading AI organizations in academia and industry, and offer educational opportunities for both civil and foreign service officers. This would be similar in structure to the Domestic Bureau Overseas Mission Model, which the State Department already has. We propose to implement this recommendation to the executive branch. Recommendation 4, this Department of State should incorporate AI-related technology training modules into key Foreign Service Institute training, such as the Ambassadorial Seminar, Deputy Chiefs of Mission Course, Political and Economic Tradecraft courses, and the A100 orientation training courses. The State Department should also develop a standalone course on emerging technologies and foreign policy for those who would specialize. As motivation, we believe that both foreign and civil service personnel need a deeper understanding of emerging technologies in order to be effective officers. They don't need to become technical experts, but they do need a basic grounding in the major technology issues that will define our global engagement strategies. We propose to implement this recommendation to the executive branch. Recommendation 5 is recommending that Congress conduct hearings to assess the department's posture and progress in orienting to technology competition. We believe Congress is a critical partner to orient the State Department for the digital age, and we believe Congress should convene hearings with testimony from distinguished experts, assess Department of State efforts, offer recommendations to accelerate sustainable implementation of technology modernization within the department, inform the State Department's budget, and encourage discussion about strategic and foreign policy priorities. Congress should also reassess comprehensive foreign relations reauthorization legislation, which hasn't been passed since 2003.
1 minute.
Last, this is an opportunity to understand how the department's efforts come together with other interagency partners, such as the Departments of Commerce, Defense, and Energy. We propose to implement this by a recommendation to the legislative branch. Those are the 5 recommendations from this LOE. Chris, Gilman, and staff, anything to add to what I've said?
Oh, got
All
it
right.
covered.
Thanks.
Nothing from me, Jason.
Any other comments, questions, feedback on Jason's recommendations?
seems like,
Jason,
go ahead, Bob.
Jason, I was just going to ask, I know that you spoke with people in the State Department on some of these recommendations. Can you give us a sense on whether or not they were receptive to these recommendations?
Yeah, they were, and I'll turn it over also to the staff for their impressions of the conversations. I think that the need for all 5 recommendations is acute within the department. The bureau that's being recommended is one that came internally. It was raised by the State Department a couple of years ago as a place to integrate a lot of functions that right now are distributed and not well resourced. So bringing together the kind of expertise that's needed within the State Department to lead on technology diplomacy that has security dimensions is, we think, a key need. Second, the need for training, which is something that we've heard from multiple people across the State Department at different levels of seniority, and the need for this council to integrate some of the functions that the senior leadership within the State Department is doing in a way that could be better harmonized. Oftentimes, the individual bureaus and the individual undersecretaries and assistant secretaries may not be aware of activities that are occurring across the department. So we felt that all 5 recommendations have support. Paul, Rebecca, Matt, Christy, anyone have other things to add?
Matt, can you hear us? Cordova?
Sure, I can. I think that's an excellent summation. I would just add 2 points. One, there's a core group inside of the State Department that supports these initiatives, so it's a good start. But this will require not only a core group, but it will require an effort across the State Department over time. That leads me to my second point. This has to be done in partnership with the Congress, and we think it's a ripe opportunity to pursue a bipartisan approach to bring Congress into the picture to make sure that this effort is sustained over time and enjoys the support and resourcing of Congress. Thank you, Jason, Dr. Matheny.
Thanks, Matt.
I would just, Jason, just to add, Peter Brown from the European Liaison Office here in DC says that he would recommend that we read their latest report from European Commission's high-level expert group that covers assessment of what constitutes trustworthy AI. We will do, and we will reach out to Peter for further conversation. So just putting this comment from our YouTube channel. Eric, did you want to say something?
My comment is, it seems like there's a consensus among the group. And it seems like this is fairly straightforward in the sense that the State Department presumably wants these authorities. In other words, the way of organizing diplomacy. So it makes good sense to me what Jason is saying.
Thanks, Eric. Any other comments, feedback? Gilman?
Yeah, it's pretty clear to us that the State Department has a very focused core group, but they're going to be under-resourced given the amount of partners. I think, traditionally you always think about the Five Eyes and maybe the EU, but AI expertise lies in many different places, in Asia, in places like India, in the Middle East. And for us to have a comprehensive program and be effective, the State Department needs the resources necessary to actually go out, reach out, have that dialogue and implement.
I think that's spot on. And I think just to elaborate a little bit, the work that we've seen being done by officers within the State Department is really heroic. And what they've already achieved in international partnerships, most recently, say, with the Global Partnership on AI, is really a credit to the conscientiousness of both the Foreign Service Corps and the Civil Service Corps working together. But they simply don't have the billets or the the authorities that they currently need in order to effectively engage on as many opportunities for diplomacy as we need to be pursuing.
Let me ask the question a little differently. Illy, we're going to make a set of suggestions, all of which require some amount of resources. And inside the government, there's always this fight over headcount and dollars. Are we going to sum up how much money is needed? How is that? How is the budgeting done? Is my question.
Yes, Eric. For each of these recommendations, we have a table that we're working on in terms of how many resources this is required, and then we will work closely with Congress and executive branch to explain our rationale behind this.
Well, there's this basic problem that a few of these things are a small number of people and a few of these things are a lot of people. And I'd like to, when we frame this, I'd like to keep them separate so things don't just get cut arbitrarily in the proposals. So, you know, for example, getting a stronger State Department technology policy group is a great idea. Jason and his team's idea. It's not very expensive. It clearly helps them, right? They have a chief scientist who's a friend of mine who's quite good, but I have no idea what kind of staff he's got.
Here. Chris McGuire, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So one thing specifically on the proposal for the new bureau, I'll just make 2 points. Number one is that the State Department's proposal is to reprogram existing resources. So this actually wouldn't require additional resources. It's mostly about moving, as Jason said, kind of disparate offices around and disparate FTEs around and getting them into one centralized place with one centralized budget. So actually in the State Department budget request, it has the exact line items and FTEs and monies that move around for this, but it doesn't cost any additional resources. It's an organizational problem. The second thing I just highlight on this is the urgency of this. This proposal has been languishing for almost a couple of years now, and there's been some kind of complaining on either side, and there's been some differing opinions of exactly how it should be implemented. But we are losing ground every second we wait and try to sort out these small potatoes. So I think we really do see an urgency to do this as soon as possible, and the existing proposal does it in a way that's cost neutral and effective.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks,
Jason,
Chris.
over to you for any last comments, questions.
Let me just check the discussion if there's any other outstanding questions from the commissioners. Everybody's got 5 seconds, I think, probably before we'll turn it over for a motion.
Yes, I think I agree with Eric. It seems to me that the commissioners are in broad agreement with all 4 of these, 5 of these recommendations. So I'd like to entertain a motion to accept the 5 recommendations forwarded by LOE 5, Marshall, as outlined by Jason. Do I have a
So
motion?
moved.
Thank you, Gilman.
Gilman, so moved.
Do I have a second?
Second, Chris Darby.
Thank you, Chris. Having a motion and a second, I'd like to ask all in favor of accepting the 5 recommendations as outlined by Jason for LOE 5 Marshall to please say aye.
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 Aye. Any commissioners opposed? Hearing none, any commissioners want to abstain? Hearing none, we have unanimous approval of the 5 recommendations from LOE 5 Marshall. We will now move to LOE 6 Ethics, which, as both Eric and I emphasized at the beginning of this program or this meeting, the commission has really kept its eye on ethics. And Eric Horvitz, one of our commissioners, has really taken the lead on this. And so I turn it over to him for his 5 minutes of fame.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to my fellow commissioners and staff on LOE 6. It's been a pleasure to work with you all. Our working recommendations align with judgments 1 to 4 in the interim report. We make 1 recommendation, but it's backed up by calling out 33 concrete recommended practices. As we stated in the interim report, defense and national security agencies must develop and field AI in a responsible, trusted, and ethical manner to sustain public support, maximize operational effectiveness, maintain the integrity of the profession of arms, strengthen international cooperation and alliances, and align with American values and commitments. Developing trustworthy AI systems is essential for operational integrity and adoption. It's also closely related to and depends on reliability, robustness, auditability, explainability, and fairness. From the earliest phase, systems should be designed with responsibility and ethics in mind. And all phases of the life cycle of the development and deployment of AI systems for national security will need to be done in accordance with the goal of preserving individual rights and liberties as protected by law. In international contexts, this includes America's commitments to international humanitarian law and human rights. Now, as a frame for the latest phase of our effort, national security departments and agencies such as the DoD and intelligence community, and of course, multiple organizations and nations have adopted or are in the process of adopting ethics AI principles. But as many note, these principles are quite high level, and they're often difficult to translate into concrete actions. For example, DoD's AI ethics principles assert that systems should be equitable, traceable, and reliable. Now, this quarter, we focused on providing agencies practical guidance for implementing commonly agreed upon AI principles and a more comprehensive strategy to develop and field AI ethically and responsibly. We developed and refer in our section to several key considerations we refer to as key considerations paradigm for short, where we identify and explain 5 key disciplinary practice areas that cover the AI lifecycle, from conception and design of systems, implementation and testing, to real-world applications and ongoing maintenance and revision as necessary. Now, the first of the 5 considerations we refer to as aligning the uses of AI and their behaviors with American values and rule of law. We focus this set of recommendations on developing uses and building systems that behave in accordance with American values and rules of law. And this includes technologies and operational policies aligning with the preservation, fairness, inclusion, human rights, and law of armed conflict. But we also want to call out in this values area the idea that systems have their own utility functions or internal models of goals and objectives at times. And we want to consider our goals and in ethics and responsibility in the context of trade-offs, how we trade off various dimensions of accuracy, as well as trade-offs in different objectives when it comes to multi-objective utility functions. The second area is on engineering practices. We call out the need for documentation throughout the AI lifecycle and reflection, infrastructure to support traceability, including auditability and forensics, security and robustness, especially regards with AI systems to intentional and unintentional failures, including adversarial attacks on machine learning-based systems, and the need for red teaming. We bubble out an important area of system performance, looking carefully at training and testing, calling out the need for standards for metrics and reporting, testing for fairness, articulation of performance standards and metrics. We also look at the importance of understanding and evaluating the performance of human-machine teams and considering the real-world complexities and interactions when we bring systems into the world, including machine-machine and machine-human interaction among machines that weren't developed in line with one another or in accordance. And then
1 minute, Eric.
Thinking about maintenance and deployment is also very important, monitoring and mitigating emergent behavior, iterative, sustained testing and validation. Fourth area is human AI interaction. We basically call out the importance of identifying the role of AI systems and humans in decision-making, and then explicit support of human AI interaction and collaboration technologies, design guidelines, algorithms and functions in support of interpretability and explanation, designs that control human-machine handoffs, and that provide cues to human operators at the level of machine confidence. And finally, we call out the need for accountability and governance, identifying responsible actors, adopting technology to strengthen accountability processes and goals, adopting policies to strengthen accountability, and including external oversight for supporting this. Our recommendation is we propose that the Commission recommend that the heads of departments and agencies implement the key considerations as a paradigm for the responsible development and fielding of AI systems. This includes developing processes and programs aimed at adopting the paradigm's recommended practices, monitoring their implementation, and continually refining them as best practices evolve. So I'll conclude there and first ask if my fellow commissioners on LOE 6 or staff have any comments.
I'll just affirm this is Mignon in this particular line of effort. I really appreciate you, Doctor, for affirming how our principles must remain intact. That if there's anything unwavering, you talked about, systems having their own utility functions and how just by the very nature of all of this, that we have to make certain trade-offs. But there's one trade-off we cannot make, and that's an abandonment of those principles. They've got to be constant. They've got to be evident. And when it comes to ethics and AI, none of this can be an afterthought. So I really appreciate early on in the process, we were having these conversations about a really difficult line of effort, but by everyone's admission, but one that is extremely necessary and necessary now before anything substantial moves forward in terms of what our scope of work and our collective lines of efforts are.
So can I ask Eric, how do you think this will play out? Do each of the departments end up having their own document? Is there a separate group that writes the detailed document? In your vision, how does this actually come to practice? Or do we write the specifics down with even greater specificity than we have now?
Well, at this current phase, we decided in collaboration with fellow commissioners to remain somewhat high level and grant flexibility to departments and agencies to consider them within the broader context of their own risk management processes according to the department application and use context at hand. But we see this ontology we've laid out with a set of best engineering practices and foci of attention. There's a foundation here for intentional coordinated efforts among the national security agencies to incorporate the practices. And we want to reserve the right to come down a little bit more specifically in later reports.
Eric, this is Andrew Moore. I remember as your line of inquiry was moving on, you did talk about some of the international aspects of this, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how you see, or just elaborate on what's in the report about us working with other countries and international organizations on AI ethics.
We view these 5 areas of consideration that we're fleshing out in Q2 right now as being desirable by all security and security-related agencies across the world. They're all positive. They help with they're aimed at trustworthiness, controllability, understandability. We hope that the key considerations we're laying out now have the potential to form the foundation for international dialogue on areas of cooperation and collaboration, even with potential adversaries.
So just to keep track of people raising their hands on the chat, I have Katharina McFarland first. No, I'm sorry, Gilman Louie first and then Katharina McFarland, sorry.
First of all, Eric, I really commend your team on the quality of work that you guys put into these recommendations. As was pointed out earlier, that the difficulties on dealing with this particular issue is putting it to practice. And it's becoming pretty clear that we need to rethink how we do testing and validation, that particularly when you have very big systems where you're putting disparate systems, heterogeneous systems together, you have these potential emergent behaviors that come out of that. Our traditional system testing at the unit level is perhaps inadequate in this new world. And I think we later on will need to do more work in thinking through potential frameworks and putting specific resources against researching the testing and validation models necessary to allow us then to test whether or not these systems meet our ethical tests.
Yeah, thanks, Gilman. Back to your comment and the earlier questions, I think collaboration is definitely going to be needed to align on how, for example, even test and verify AI system reliability and performance. And this includes along shared values with allies, such as fairness and privacy, and also be important with partners that we work with for establishing interoperability and trust. So we see that these efforts potentially include dialogues between the U.S. and strategic competitors, as well as to reduce chances of inadvertent escalation, especially with the prospect of adversarial machine learning attacks, but in particular with allies.
Katharina is next, and then Steve Chin.
Thanks. I'd like to leverage a couple of the comments made. I think it's really important to understand this global environment in which we live, particularly as we adopt software to what Gilman was talking about and integrate different variants from global sources. And so I think it's very important that we are at this high level right now, establishing what our premises and what our goals are, because we have a lot of work in the details. We try to take accountability. We don't even have yet the test tools, to the point made earlier, to necessarily trace, i.e. the appropriate forensics to determine where and how origin and accountability can be held. But as a nation, what these values that were so carefully wrought tie to is how we care about our value systems. And so we may have work to do, but we've at least put out sort of the thesis to establish, I think, the right things. But again, these levels of efforts, they cross. So the State Department will be part of this establishing, using these premises. They attending to how do we look at protecting IP and other assets before they go into the places where we don't think they'll be appropriately utilized. Those LOEs across the board, training, application, all apply here in investing. So I think these are good foundations.
Yeah, and so well said, Katharina. You know, part of what we've tried to do is just take this to the next level of concreteness. We see resistance among people writing down principles to do that around the world. And when you do that, you immediately, as you alluded to, hit into R&D areas. We need research and development. We call out where we need R&D as well as we go.
Thank you. I believe Steve Chin is next.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that just as with the V&V, the AI ethics portion, it can only be in the context of a specific operational use and an operational workflow. Clearly, you can have AI algorithms or approaches or even machine learned artifacts that would be ethical or not be ethical depending on exactly how they're used. And one of the challenges is to evaluate them in a specific workflow and also clearly describe that workflow so that it's understood that an evaluation of ethicality or not, just as validity or not, and I'm sure we'll get to in LOE2, is only in the context of operations.
Yeah, no, very good point, Stephen. And we did as much as we could point out it's not just systems, but it's uses, scenarios, and context as we went through this, the recommendations and best practices.
Dr. Horowitz, before I turn it over to Bob Ward, the Vice Chair, I have one question that was submitted online by Dr. Michael Clare, who asked, what is the Commission doing to ensure that its ethical recommendations are being taken seriously?
Well, this is the second quarter report. We have more work to do as we refine both the details of the content as well as the recommendations moving forward. The recommendations will be aimed at working with the executive branch and we'll be pursuing the right level of engagement to seek assurances. But there's much work to be done. We've already been engaging with multiple agencies in socializing these ideas as well as getting feedback. But we'll pursue our recommendations and directions for recommendations to the executive branch.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz. Over to you, Mr. Work.
A follow on to the last question, and also to pull a string on what Eric asked earlier. You know, whenever I talk ethics with people inside the agencies, they always ask, yeah, but how do you implement it? And so I'd like to task the staff as the Vice Chair, Illy, to come up with some possible implementation language to provide to LOE 6. so that they can consider over the next quarter if we want to get more pointed or whether we want to stay at a broader level. But I think this is a very important point, simply because I think a lot of people just don't know how to implement the ethics. With that, given our time, I'd like to move to the vote. LOE 6, Eric and LOE 6 have made one recommendation, and I'd like to entertain a motion to accept that recommendation.
So move.
Please.
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Griffiths. Do I have a second?
Second, it's Eric.
Thank you, Eric. Right, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any commissioners object? Hearing none, do any commissioners want to abstain? Hearing none, we have unanimous agreement to adopt the recommendation of LOE 6 under ethics. And we will now move to LOE 1. Dr. Moore is going to talk about this, and Dr. Moore wins the prize for the most recommendations in this quarter. So we have 11 recommendations to go through. Andrew, I'll give you an extra minute.
Wow, thank you. I appreciate that extra minute. It will be used superbly. The first thing I want to do is sincerely thank my fellow commissioners in this line of inquiry, Dr. Horvitz, Dr. Mark, Dr. Chen, Dr. Ford, and Dr. Schmidt. And in fact, we've had help from throughout the commission, and of course, none of this would have worked at all without the efforts of the staff, who are the ones who really take credit for putting this together. So in the previous quarter, we looked at the broad lens of AI R&D towards national security. This quarter, we've been focusing on the DoD research enterprise specifically. Although there's lots of positive things we can do, there is a significant issue here, which is that many of the models for research and innovation that worked so well perhaps in other parts of the history of DoD, within the world of agile software development and rapid response and rapid deployment of AI, are unwieldy. And so this, the 11 recommendations you're going to see here are all to do with helping really empower the people who are responsible for building these kinds of AIs within the Department of Defense. Okay, so let's jump in. We had 4 classes. So although I've got 11 recommendations for you, they come into 4 overall buckets. First one is making sure that we've got the right tools for all the AI practitioners or all the AI needs within DoD. Second one is test and evaluation, and making sure that we are supporting the research enterprise in being able to do testing and evaluation, because it won't be long before 90% of the entire length of an AI project is testing and validation, and only 10% will be the initial development. So we have to be good at this, or else we'll see our country's speed of innovation grinding to a halt. Third one is really helping the transition of concepts from research to proof of concept to small-scale deployments to large-scale deployments, and making sure that we've got a very smooth pipeline for that to happen. And the fifth one is making sure that the defense labs get what they need to be innovative through setting up the right kinds of partnerships. So at this point, I'm going to jump into the specifics of all of these, and we're going to go through those 4 things in order. Research entities in DoD are limited by a lack of enterprise-wide access to data and computing and software. So the ways that we can help with this are, firstly, we are strong proponents of building a certified AI repository of software, so that it's not the case that people in different divisions or different services have to completely reinvent the process of getting hold of the most effective software that they need. Frankly, compared with academia or in commercial industry, this lack of any kind of centralized software repository is really slowing down DoD. Secondly is promoting the authorization to operate, the reciprocity of the ability to not have everyone having to go through their own risk analysis and allowing of the various bits of software which are in this repository. Third one is data. And again, if, for instance, if you're designing a system to detect trip hazards on an aircraft carrier, you could spend 18 months just gathering the data, unless it happened that you've pooled your data around the services and already have images around for being able to do that kind of research. So the speed of research does depend on the availability of data, and this should be a shared piece of work, not a set of individual siloed pieces of work. Finally, the funding for these kind of processes within the labs, we need to allow multi-year roadmaps. And so Section 219 of the Laboratory Initiated Research Authority could be expanded to allow projects and programs to exist over multiple years.
Got a little less than 2 minutes, Andrew.
Very good, thank you. We've already talked about the importance of testing and evaluation. So we are going to propose setting up a series of platforms to allow rapid testing and sharing of testing methodologies. In our detailed report, you can see the line of different approaches to testing and validation which are needed. This is also going to hook in closely with what we're doing on the ethical evaluation of software systems. Third one is transition. And it's in industry now, it is very common for an issue to be discovered, for quick research to be turned into a deployed system, to be validated, and for that to take a matter of days or weeks. And we've, across industry, we've seen many of these very rapid deployments happening during coronavirus, for example. So that's going to need both a culture change, but it's also going to need specific changes to the DoD budget construct, which was designed for very large long-term weapon systems, to instead allow these rapid staged deployments, going all the way from research through to deployment. And the final thing that we really think is useful here is going to be better coordination between the researchers in the labs and their counterparts in academia and industry. So there are plenty of administrative hurdles around public release of data or ideas or software and the ability to share ideas. Many of these are outside of the area that would be regarded as high security issues. They are simply about making sure that everyone has AI know-how to be able to operate. And so we recommend directing the services to adopt an open innovation model and to create a DoD research and development database to make available a comprehensive view of the ongoing R&D efforts across the services. And that's it. Thank you very much. Next thing I'd love to do is check in with my distinguished fellow commissioners for comments or things that I might have missed out in this summary.
It's very well said.
Well, this is Steve Ken. I just want to re-emphasize one of the points that really we have to see this tremendous shift in reducing the time cycle to get updates, because AI is such a rapidly moving technology, and that's was one of your points, and we have to move out of these long procurement cycles, and we have to move much more closely to an agile model where we're constantly experimenting with and having the synergy between the users and the operators with the AI and the people who are developing and enhancing the AI, both at the engineering level, which is more LOE2, and at the research level in LOE1. We have to dramatically and exponentially increase the cross-fertilization between those three different communities and have them in constant contact.
The other thing I would add is that in the private sector, people use open source libraries like GitHub, and there are all sorts of government restrictions around that. As part of the proposal that you're seeing, there is essentially a way of doing a repository for that stuff. So again, what we're trying to do is make it faster and quicker to acquire the latest software.
And just to clarify what Eric says there, we're not suggesting that we open up GitHub for use for developing DoD systems, but that model dramatically accelerates the ability to rapidly create new AIs.
Can we have Gilman Louis next?
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate the team's work on this. You know, I think there is a world beyond the Agile method that's going to be required for us to actually do this kind of work, where you're going to have near real-time updates as you're finding out autonomous driving and other commercial systems. That, as you point out, the old model of big block system every 1.5 to 5 year updates is not reasonable for any AI deployed system. But I also think that the department, as well as other agencies, need to rethink about how they do compute, because the level of compute necessary to do this is an order or 2 orders of magnitude larger than what most people are thinking about these days. And we need to think of it as a more shared resource on the compute side, because without the compute, it's going to be very difficult to generate these kinds of new models and testing of algorithms and training sets.
Thank you, Gilman. I'm really glad you brought that up. That is an essential part of our proposal here, and it is necessary. In general, if you try to silo everyone compute to their own worlds, you get less than 20% utilization by researchers of these incredibly expensive machines. So you've got a huge saving in ability to do massive scale machine learning if you've got these pooled resources in some fashion.
I think Bob Ward is next.
Thanks, Illy, and thanks, Andrew. Several of the LOEs have talked about the importance, and I think Gilman just really kind of wrapped it up, the importance of TEVV to our future if we really want to become a world-class AI organization and speed applications in the field. Did your group give any thought on who in the Department of Defense, for example, would be tasked to do this? Would you recommend it go under the DOT&E, the Operation Test and Evaluation, or would this be a new organization? Do we have the chops to do it within the federal government and DoD?
Very good. I think we can see this going under the CIO's office or through the Secretary of Defense, through the JAIC. I would love to ask some of the folks working on the details of the documents to comment on the specific recommendations.
Thanks, Andrew. Tess?
Thanks, sir. We did evaluate, we talked to folks across the department and had in the recommendation structured it to leave it to the department to determine which entity within that organization, within the department, would have the responsibility to implement these standardized frameworks and tool sets. Within the document, you'll see we point to good work underway in terms of the tool set at TRMC, and then work ongoing to start to get work on the standardized framework ongoing between DOT&E, who has responsibility for setting the operational testing and evaluation standards across the department, as well as they're working in close partnership with the JAIC. So there's a lot of good work ongoing across the department. And I think with with this recommendation, we're putting the need to set the, direct the entity to do it. And then within a 6-month time frame to really expedite progress. That's good work that's already ongoing.
If I could just do a quick follow-up on that, we do a centralized set of expertise around building test harnesses is well worth it, because otherwise people will struggle in different organizations. But we also do, as a commission, we are very much understand that extremely different issues in different parts of the use of artificial intelligence, space-based sensing versus speech understanding versus large-scale training versus autonomous vehicles. The testing and validation that you need in each of those is different.
Thank you, Andrew. Turn it over to other commissioners on this LOE, if they have to add any other comments.
I think we can then move on to voting, Nilly. We have 11 recommendations before us from LOE1 Invest, as outlined by Dr. Moore. I'd like to entertain a motion to accept all 11, please.
Motion.
Thank you, Katharina. Second?
Seconded.
Second.
Thank you, Safra. We have a motion and a second. So the recommendation for the commission is to accept all 11 of the recommendations as outlined in LOE1 Invest and as explained by Dr. Moore. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Do any commissioners object? Do any commissioners want to enter an abstention? Great, we have unanimous approval of the 11 recommendations in LOE1 Invest. And we will now move to our last LOE, which is Apply, focused on applications. And Safra Katz will take us through these recommendations.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you to the other commissioners on LOE2, including Katrina McFarland, Andy Jassy, Dr. Steve Chen, Dr. Ken Ford, and of course you, Bob, and to the staff that has done an enormous amount of work. In the first quarter, this LOE offered recommendations to advance DoD adoption of AI-enabled applications by creating senior leadership mechanisms. And I think those are incredibly important. As a reminder, it included the creation of a senior steering committee, tri-chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Principal Deputy Director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It also included the maintenance of the current seniority of the Director of the JAIC, and that the Director should report directly to the Secretary of Defense. We believe these leadership-focused recommendations are critical to accelerate DoD AI application in the near term. Now, we're grateful for the support that we've actually gotten from both the House and the Senate during the ongoing NDAA proceedings. And our second quarter recommendations really build off those leadership ideas to ensure that the department has an enduring ability to apply, as Bob said, to apply AI for national security and defense. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read off the screens the 6 recommendations. I know you can all see them. But what I will do is I'm going to try to summarize the operational goals and tie them together. These recommendations establish a strategic approach for identifying, resourcing, and ultimately fielding AI-enabled applications that address clear operational challenges. They also seek to create mechanism for tactical experimentation to ensure that technical capabilities meet the mission and the operator needs. And finally, they provide paths to accelerate adoption of business AI applications that are critical for institutional agility. The recommendation impacts the impact aspects of each of the apply consensus judgments there on the side. And in particular, they aim to enable execution of core national security missions, overcome bureaucratic impediments and inertia that are inhibiting state-of-the-art capabilities coming to fruition. And they also look at finding ways to fund pockets of innovation and to create strategic change and cause real experimentation out in the field. This quarter, we also include recommendations that directly address the consensus judgment that the US government is not adequately leveraging basic commercial AI to improve business practices and save taxpayer dollars. So together, LOE2's recommendation for Q1 and Q2 attempt to drive the necessary strategic change across the Department of Defense, enabling our forces to have enduring access to leading capabilities. And I guess at this time, I welcome feedback from all the other commissioners on these recommendations.
This is Steve Chen. I just want to re-emphasize one of the points that Safra made that also came up in LOE1. So we really need to reduce the time cycle and encourage the cross-fertilization, again, between research, applications, and the end operations. And that's actually reflected in two of the recommendations. And I feel that that is one of the principal roadblocks to effective use of AI in operations. And so that's, I can't overemphasize that enough.
That's so true, because sometimes there's work in one area. One of the biggest issues is really the silos within the government, whether it's an R&D or an actual application, or within the DoD, within the services or the different organizations. And all of these recommendations really try to focus on getting leverage. We focused in the first quarter on leadership because that's very critical. And now it's really about leveraging and fielding and sharing, whether it's data or technology throughout the organization, and reduce the inertia that builds up.
I think we have Gilman next, Safra.
Okay. You're on mute, Gilman.
I think it's really important that your third recommendation gets taken seriously. You know, it's one thing to build a lot of great technologies, then you prove it in the labs, and you prove it in the software models and the simulation. But until you actually put it out into the field and use it in live testing, that you actually develop the concepts of operation. Because in some cases, it could take over a decade. I mean, we learn about, you know, how long it took us to actually integrate the airplane, the aircraft carrier, you know, all of our modern systems. You don't get it overnight. And those ConOps can only be developed if users actually implement these in these exercises. And without that, we're not going to get there.
That's absolutely
wholeheartedly number 3.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, until you use the tools, you're not even thinking about the capabilities, because what's going to cause a very virtuous cycle as these AI-enabled applications are rolled into exercises and tabletops, war games, this is going to change the way people think about what's possible. And the only thing that can really generate a lot of that, plus we'll learn what's not possible, what doesn't work well. So I totally agree with you.
Katharina next, and then Steve Chen.
Thanks, Yeli. I think one of the things that we talked about in the interim assessment and you're hearing as a thread, I think I'd like to emphasize, and that is that in particular for LOE2, where we talk about national security missions and national security applications, that national defense strategy is a guiding post. If you recall, the SecDef just recently measured himself in his performance against the national defense strategy. And the tilting of the wheel tendency is towards programs of record, which are large, very visible systems like F-35. AI as an enabler is a thread that enhances, improves. It's not something that you can put your hands around like a commodity, and oftentimes gets lost in that thread. And so the idea is that we're promoting across all these levels of effort are tending to try to bring the visibility of artificial intelligence up and measure it so it gains that visibility. So if you take a look again at the use of it in tri-chair committee where you have senior leadership focused on it, and you look at it being played out in exercises, the intent is as an enabler to give it visibility, which I think is really important. We may not have the granularity yet because we're only on the second recommendations, but I think we're going to be able to get there.
Thank you, Katharina. Steve?
Yeah, and I just want to sort of play on what both Katarina said and what Gilman said. So I think increasingly, as we see increasing competition in the algorithmic aspect of the warfare, I think the AI is going to be the secret determining sauce, not particularly the hardware-oriented things like the range or different more typical quantifiables in the military system. And so we need to recognize how to evaluate and rapidly get the AI in there, even though it might not be the headliner program of record. And then I want to take what Gilman said and put it even more extremely. Gilman was saying we need to make it easier to get these things out into the war games and see how they work. I want to actively encourage taking half-baked AI ideas as well as other ideas out into the war games, because I think then you will see unique applications of them, and you will see, this virtuous cycle as Safra was referring to. And I think that's the key in the cross-fertilization between the operations, the operational tempo, the strategy development. Many new strategies, I'm sure, will be developed because of some increasing new widget of AI. And also, even the lower level commanders have to understand how better to work with the AI. How do you work with the drone differently if you can reprogram it every single flight with a complex different policy? It completely changes the whole nature of the game, and we need everybody to get used to that as quickly as possible.
That's right.
Thank you, Steve. I think Dr. Horwitz is next.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the presentation, Safra. We were talking a lot about the test beds and these application areas for gaining experience with new powers that AI can give us. We have to keep in mind that the same set of recommendations can and should be applied to the rough edges, to understanding how to do human AI interaction under time critical situations, under stress, under cognitive overload, how to work with systems that are over-trusted in lieu of blind spots they might have, how best to relay confidences from systems and how well people can use them in making decisions as human AI systems overall. And so there's a lot to learn, and maybe supporting more general red teaming not just of the systems, but of human AI teams using these systems to understand their weaknesses and strengths.
That's right.
Thank you, Eric. I think Katharina is next.
Yeah, thank you, Yuli, and thank you guys for the comments. I think this is a really good dialogue. One thing we got to remember, our system is built on risk aversion, and we have a challenge, and one of our assessments was essentially, I'm going to quote it, that the adoption and deployment of AI requires a different approach to acquisition. And coming from that world, I can only underscore how many times I had to face a very irresilient system to try to adopt AI. And I think a lot of the LOE efforts trying to unhinge those problems, like getting a better testing system, setting goals and processes aside, putting more direct objectives in place will help. But I think we all have to shoulder more in this area to try to adapt towards an accelerated view. And these are just stepping stones. And of course, we'll solicit all the inputs that we can from anyone to try to change that risk paradigm and that risk aversion. And of course, the stoic nature of how we do the work in the department.
Thank you, Katharina. And I think you really addressed the question that we got online from ZS Congress that says, what is the most pressing concern when it comes to integrating AI in defense? So anybody else wants to add, comment, provide any feedback?
Yeah, Ilya, this is Bob. I think we've covered one of them, and that's the testing, evaluation, validation, and verification. I always get them out of order. But we have to prove that we can do these TEBB activities across, as I think Gilman said, each of the applications will require a different TEBB expertise. And the department doesn't have that yet. So my most pressing concern is our being able to build up that activity so that it is efficient and can work at scale. The other thing is overpromising. Generally, what has happened is sometimes you overpromise what AI can do, the operators are disappointed, they become discouraged and are less apt to to pursue it. But one of the things that, so not overpromising and waiting for the operators to start to pull AI applications. And you're starting to see this across the board. The Special Operations Command is using AI in extraordinarily innovative ways. The Indo-Pacific region is trying to figure out how to use it more carefully, as well as EUCOM. All of the services are pursuing predictive maintenance for their aircraft and for their ships, even for batteries on submarines. So you're starting to see the operators say, okay, we believe and we'll pull on this, but if we can't do the TEBB and prove that these can perform in the way that we say they will perform, then we'll have a problem. So those are the things that really concern me.
Thank you, sir. Gilman next, then Katharina afterwards.
I think there's going to be a point somewhere maybe 5 or 6 years from now when we kind of get our hands around the basic, uses of AI, that we will have a choice to make whether or not we'll continue to use AI for incremental improvement versus highly disruptive change. And you think about offensive uses, defensive uses, support uses of AI, we tend to like to use new technologies within the department and national security apparatus in a way that doesn't change the wiring diagrams. It makes us a little bit faster, a little bit better, but we don't want to change the way we think about our mental models of operating or constructs, organizations. I think the power of AI is that it could disrupt all of that. And if we're not willing to disrupt ourselves, we're going to let potential adversaries and competitors disrupt us.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Gilman.
I just want to interestingly leverage what Gilman said unexpectedly. I think if we think about what's going on during this time with the pandemic, we have relied more on AI in some of its more rudimentary forms, but in places where it was absolutely unable to go. I've done more work within the Defense Department and outside of the Defense Department between entities and have remained productive through the use of AI in various tools, to include machine learning, to include some of the RPA, robotic processes, and it was accelerated through this pandemic. So there's some hope here because people are starting by having to, not because they want to, but because they have to, start having and developing some confidence in these tools. So It might be a small silver lining here, but we are starting to see some of this change.
Yeah, I agree. For real AI deployment, you've got to have change management in the organization as well as potentially technology, but it's the change management that really matters. So you kind of need a crisis to make these deployments happen. What I really want to see, and what I think the Commission is helping us with here, is when and if there's a big world crisis and our DoD needs to be nimble, for us to have that nimbleness imbued throughout DoD instead of still thinking in terms of these 18-month technology cycles.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, one of the things that we're trying to push is sharing of what's working, sharing across the silos. And that's why this leadership group is as important as it is. It not only raises the level of importance, but the classified annex, really all of these things make everyone focus on the same goal. And especially in a crisis or in a difficult time, this is really the time where you start to look around and see what has worked, what is working. Let's get in on that. And we're trying, and I think part of our focus is also what's been experimented with in the lab, what's been experimented with in tabletops, in all sorts of different war games, and how do we leverage that across the groups?
Thank you, Safra. I know Bob Worka is looking at the watch, so any last comments, questions before I turn it over to the Vice Chair? Okay.
Thank you, Illy. And thanks to all the commissioners for the great discussion. All right, LOE 2, as outlined by Safra, have 6 recommendations. So I'd like to entertain a motion to accept as a group the 6 recommendations as outlined by LOE 2 apply. Can I please have a motion to accept the recommendations?
So moved.
Thanks, Dr. Griffiths. Do we have a second?
Seconded.
Thanks a lot, Jason. All right, having a motion to accept and a second, I'd like to ask all of the commissioners if they approve the recommendation to accept the 6 recommendations as outlined by Safra and for LOE 2. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Are there any commissioners opposed? Are there any commissioners who would like to enter an abstention? All right, hearing none, we have a unanimous vote to accept all 6 of the recommendations for LOE 2. Thank you to all the LOE leads. I think your explanations of the different LOEs were concise and on point. And we now have unanimous approval of all 35 recommendations from all 6 lines of effort in our Q2 report. I believe we have about 20 minutes left, Illy. So this would be the time to throw open questions to our listeners, if there are any.
Thank you, sir. So I'll start by one question we got from one of the participants, Dr. Colin Garvey from Stanford University, who is a postdoc student there. He says, I'm concerned the commission overstates the threat of China pushing the US toward a Cold War style arms race that is likely to amplify and accelerate the use of AI for authoritarian and anti-democratic purposes by both sides. Rather than countering an autocratic adversary with new technology, would it not be better to frame the NSCAI mission as promoting and enhancing democracy through AI? So since you were the last one, sir, Mr. Work, do you want to take that question? And then anybody else that wants to chime in?
Well, I'll try to start off. I know Eric has a lot of comments, a lot of thoughts on this, as do all of the commissioners. I don't think that we are overhyping the threat from China in the field of artificial intelligence. They've been quite clear that they believe that artificial intelligence would allow them to leapfrog the United States and allow them to become the preeminent military power on the planet. And they're intent on doing just that. They have an AI plan that says, essentially, the comic book story is, we want to catch the Americans by 2020. And in my mind, they have caught us. We're ahead in some areas, they're ahead in others, but we have broad parity. And both of us are kind of pushing each other. By 2025, they would like to surpass the United States in AI technologies. And by 2030, they would like to be the world leader. For the United States, this is an extremely important competition because of its ramifications for our national security and our conventional deterrence and our strategic deterrence. So I don't think that we overhype the threat. To the point on, shouldn't we focus on the democratic values? And I believe if you look at our interim report, we make clear that the competition in AI is a competition in values, and that we would like democratic values, which value personal privacy and rule of law, to really infuse our AI applications. And we can already see just before our eyes that the Chinese are using AI in very malign ways, especially against the Uyghurs. So I don't think, in my view, I don't think we overhype the threat. It's a very serious challenge. That's the way I would call it. It's a challenge that we have to meet. And this is a competition in values. And every time you hear commissioners speak, we emphasize really two overarching things: values and ethics, values and ethics. And I think that's very, very important on everything we do. So that's my answer, but I know that the other commissioners have thought long and hard about this too.
Thank you, sir. I have Gilman, Andrew Moore, and Katharina in line to answer this.
Well, I don't think any nation, definitely not ours, wants to have the second best AI out there protecting oneself, particularly if there's some sort of national security threat that's out there. And that includes dealing with potential threats from our competitors. On the flip side of that, I think there are opportunities where ourselves and some of our competitors like China can lay out the appropriate frameworks for how AI should be used. We should all share in our responsibilities to make sure AI is used in a positive way that allows us to be safer, that we don't have unsafe deployments of AI, that we cannot allow AI to get out of control in a way that does harm to humanity. I also think there's room for competition local. If by competing with the Chinese and other nation states, we move the ball forward on exploration, on science, and on improvement of the environment and health, let those be the areas of appropriate competition. But in the areas of national security, we cannot afford to be second best. We stated that as a goal, that to keep our primacy in national security, and we're not going to give it up. But there are other areas that we can cooperate with the Chinese and that we should actually work together with them on, and positive areas where we can compete, because competition sometimes is good, moves the ball forward.
Andrew Moore?
I was going to say pretty much exactly what Gilman just said. It is, there's nothing about this which is saying that across our entire economy, we're going to ignore each other and just separately do AI from now on. But specifically for the purposes of national security, this commission is very firmly convinced that it would be a bad idea for US DoD to relax or fail to pay attention to it. This is the real push. The extent to which we do get global agreements on non-misuse of AI, global agreements on not using artificial intelligence against one's own population, global agreements about not using AI illegally in weapon systems, I think we will all be very supportive of going after those kinds of global agreements.
I think Katharina was next.
Yes, thank you, Yili. I'm going to leverage off the three gentlemen before me and mention that if you read what Eric Horowitz's team in Level Effort 6 talks about, it gave the principles, the framework of how we want to implement AI in our core value system. If we take a look at the value systems between our country and other countries, we are naturally going to fall and look to align with other countries that share those values. And there is an economy tied to the principles of development and fielding and use of AI. It's here to stay, and it's growing. And we want to be a strong economic country, and I think it's important that we understand how we can attain those goals within those value systems. So yes, I think that there is a natural tendency to want our value systems to prevail. And yes, I think it's important that we consider the economic benefits and problems if we don't adopt AI appropriately, and how we adapt AI will forecast, I think, with our partners who share our values, where the economy and where the strengths of AI will be provided.
Thank you, Katharina. Anybody else wants to comment? Eric?
I completely agree with what just been said. Could not have said it better.
Thank you. Any other comments on this one? Eric, I think Horowitz, you're muted.
Oh, I'll make a comment that our biggest competitor is status quo and actually innovation, to be honest.
Thank you. I have a comment that I would like to read from Roy Garris from our YouTube channel, who says, on a comment made by Eric Schmidt, he hits the nail on the head. As an AI lead for Social Security, we need details similar to the FedRAMP, FIPS, and NIST level controls in order to audit our own system for compliance. Anybody wants to comment on that? Comment by Roy Garris.
All I can say is what Roy's trying to do makes perfect sense to me. And the applicability of AI across our government in terms of improving its efficiency, saving money, making it more effective is profound.
Thanks, Eric. Any other comments, questions?
I'll just agree with Roy Garris's comments also, and the technology around data stewardship, lineage, and especially personally identifiable information concealment, so that these things are used for good rather than potential privacy breaches, is critical. And just as you're seeing in data systems or data intensive applications across the industry, when this data is supporting artificial intelligence, you do also need to use those same level of controls. And I do see more innovation in the industries which have got strong compliance regulations than in the industries for which that is emerging. So I very much support your effort.
Thank you, Andrew. Question for Dr. Jose Marie Griffiths. Are there certain projects that the Reserve Corps would work on? Does the Reserve Corps model lend itself to certain types of work or certain projects the Commission will recommend? You're muted, Dr.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I know I was unmuting myself. It really depends. I mean, setting up the different nodes, the nodes would have responsibility for various areas depending on how they're set up. They could be set up around topic areas, such as the example we gave in the report, or they could be set up geographically. But we think mostly they'll be set up by topic areas, and then the requests will go in to those nodes for various work needs to be done. And we anticipate over time, those nodes could well evolve and expand to incorporate other areas.
Thank you. Anybody from LOE3 want to add anything, Justin?
In the recommendation, the primary idea is that they would, or the main idea is that they would serve as advisors, instructors, and as developers. They're supposed to serve a minimum of 38 days a year as special government employees, which is based again off of a military reserve model. So the idea would be that they would do work that they could accomplish in 38 days each year, with the possibility of extending longer. But time, I think, would be the large constraint there.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you very much. Illy, what else do you have?
I have one more question from John Davison. He says, why not urge Congress to establish human rights safeguards for AI systems? The Q2 reports indicates many alleged recommendations, but for ethical AI, it speaks of consideration, best practices, etc. He says, what a better way to ensure an intentional government-wide coordinated effort on ethical AI than having Congress set baseline AI rules. Dr. Horowitz, if you want to take that one, or Jessica. You're muted.
Sorry. We're still learning a lot about what it means to take principles like fairness, inclusiveness, transparency, and other, what we call it, principles of ethics into the world. To date, there's been efforts in agencies like FTC, for example, when it comes to fairness and bias, when it comes to safety, DOT, NHTSA, and so on. The idea of saying there's one thing called ethical principles, and we demand Congress do legislation around this and coordinate, I think is challenging. Is a challenging one. I would like to say that we will do our best to pull together what you called out as best practices and best understandings, and think through best recommendations to make when it comes to coordinated efforts. My sense is this would be along the lines of different dimensions of what we call out in terms of responsibility and ethics, including notions of trustworthiness, transparency, auditability, traceability, and so on, rather than using the word broadly and calling generally for this to be done by Congress.
And I will co-sign it by saying when you speak of a legislative or a congressional solution, that is but a snapshot in time. And so that is why a blended approach and a number of complementary players are needed. Some are more nimble and can act more in real time, and other, like I said, legislative bodies, laws can often be static, even though the application the application may not be, and that's where the other players come in.
So, Ilya, I think we should finish up a few minutes early. Is there anything else you wanted to do procedurally?
No, I think we have covered everything we have had in the agenda for today. We will publish the memo, the formal memo, on Wednesday. I thank you all on behalf of the staff, and over to you.
So let's just review what's going to happen. So we've had our public meeting and everything was approved. We're going to publish to the public something on Wednesday, which we would like everyone to read, and we encourage you to study it very carefully. We have worked hard on this. The staff and commissioners will continue to work with the target for another iteration in 3-ish months. Those dates have not been set yet. We look forward to everyone's feedback. I'd like to say that this commission and my partnership with Illy, with Bob, and with all of the commissioners has been incredibly rewarding personally, and I'm looking forward to this continuing. I think the debate is exactly what we should be doing, and I think that people who originally created this community will be very happy. We're briefing them later in the week. They'll be very happy to see the both collegial and thorough way in which we're doing this in the open. Bob, would you like to add anything as well?
Thank you, Eric. I would just like to thank 3 sets of people. The first are the commissioners. I mean, I think you can see by the number and quality of the recommendations that came out of all of the lines of efforts that all of the commissioners have been personally engaged, and they've thrown themselves into the subject, and I believe have really met the criteria that Congress was hoping for when they established this commission. The second thing is to Illy and the staff. They've just been tremendous. I would argue I can't think of a better staff, and they have really made the lives of all of the commissioners easy because they are so responsive and have provided such stellar support. And finally, I think Illy, what was the total number that we had listening in this afternoon?
I think close to 200, but
about 200. think we had 200 RSVPs. So I'd like to thank the citizens and friends that tuned in this afternoon to listen to this important subject. And I want to thank you for your support. With that, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much. Ilya, anything final?
I think I have to turn it over to Angela to formally conclude the meeting.
Angela, please finish this up.
Thank you for attending NSCI's first virtual meeting. This meeting stands adjourned.
Thank you all.